In the Prelude to Dune trilogy, the Fremen plotline has almost nothing to do with any of the other elements of the story. The machinations of the Harkonnens, Duke Leto's struggle with his new responsibilities, the schemes of the Emperor Shaddam, absolutely none of it relates to the Fremen and what they were doing this whole time. But that's not to say that it's unimportant. After all, this is the only storyline that actually focuses on the titular world of Dune. And so, we must go all the way back to the beginning. Back when the Baron was still thin, when Leto's father was still alive, and when Shaddam had only just decided to get rid of his own father. Like his son, Emperor Elrond IX resented the many restrictions upon the power of the Emperor, and, like Fenring, believed that the key to increasing the power of House Corrino was connected to the spice. But before the Bene Tleilax showed up with their offer of trying to create an artificial spice substitute, he believed that the path to controlling the spice, and thus controlling the universe, was understanding the spice, how it was made and where it came from. Specifically, I mean. They all knew it came from Arrakis, but no one knew how it came to be and why only Arrakis of all planets could it be found. To this end, he appointed an imperial planetologist named Prelude-Kynes for the task, dispatching him to Arrakis to study the planet and discover the origins of the spice melange. Prelude-Kynes was born to a family of low-level imperial bureaucrats that had been deployed to Seleucia Secundus, the inhospitable prison planet that was used as training ground for the elite imperial Sardaukar troops. It had been devastated by atomics centuries ago, and yet there was still life, hardy, savage, and vicious, that clung there in spite of those conditions. And from a young age, Prelude-Kynes had been fascinated by the planet and its life forms. And it was this fascination that eventually set him on the path to becoming a planetologist. Kynes could best be described as myopic. Planetology was his bread and butter. It was what occupied his thoughts every waking moment. He knew nothing of niceties or social graces or sensitivity and couldn't read a room to save his life. He always spoke his mind, not out of malice or rudeness or even contempt for authority, simply that it never occurred to him to say anything other than what he was thinking. Kynes was surprised by the Emperor's assignment, but it's not like he was going to turn down a chance to study the most important planet in the Dune universe, and so he soon arrived on Arrakis, to the grudging welcome of the Harkonnens. Never the most gracious of hosts, Baron Harkonnen and his associates mostly ignored Prelude-Kynes, which was fine by him, as it gave him more time to study the planet. And the more he saw of Arrakis, the more fascinated he became. By rights, a planet with so little water shouldn't support life at all, let alone anything as large as a sandworm. And yet, organic life, great or small, not only seemed to survive, but thrive on Arrakis. At one point in his early expeditions, Kynes discovered a massive salt flat, telling him that not only had there been water, there had once been oceans on Arrakis. With this discovery, Kynes' fascination redoubled, and he began to imagine what Arrakis must have looked like when there was water. He also began to speculate on the possibilities of terraformation, whether or not it might be possible to make Arrakis a green world once again. Of course, such a plan would require more than the efforts of just one man. If he was going to pull this off, he was going to need local support, and that was difficult to come by. Of course, the Harkonnens didn't care about Arrakis beyond the spice. Most of the other locals were too busy wrapped up in their day-to-day concerns, and most Fremen avoided Kynes, and the ones who didn't were not in any mood to reveal any information to him. This was particularly disappointing to Kynes, as since the Fremen were the native inhabitants of Arrakis, they would have to play a starring role in the terraforming of the planet. Then, one day, while out on yet another expedition of study, Kynes stumbled across a group of Harkonnen bravos fighting with 3 Fremen youths. Thanks to their heavy armor, the Harkonnen guardsmen were clearly just toying with the Fremen, and were intending to kill them for sport. By now, Kynes had all but forgotten the Emperor's command to discover the origins and nature of the spice. Now, his mind was wholly bent to the idea of making Arrakis green. The Fremen, as stated previously, would play a vital role in this, and here were the Harkonnens killing the Fremen. Kynes was no fighter. The fact that he managed to kill one of the Harkonnen guards when he tried to intervene was all down to luck rather than skill. But the surprise and confusion of his unexpected attack gave the Fremen the opportunity to kill the rest of them, leaving behind no witnesses, though one was injured in the process. The Fremen didn't know what to make of Kynes. By now they knew he was an Imperial citizen in some way associated with the Harkonnens, yet he had just killed Harkonnen men to save their lives. Ultimately, Fremen tradition won out, and they believed that they owed him a water debt for saving their lives, so they decided to bring him to their sietch. The Fremen's names were Turok, Omen, and the one that was injured was Stilgar, the man who would one day become Naib, or leader, of the Redwall Sietch, the very same tribe that would later adopt Paul and Jessica. Needless to say, Kynes was very impressed by the sietch and what it contained. According to the Harkonnens, and pretty much every other official Imperial source, the Fremens were primitives, barely capable of sustaining themselves, certainly not in the numbers that Kynes was seeing. Turns out that was entirely deliberate. The Fremen were just as capable of getting spice as the Harkonnens, and, through middlemen like water merchants, they would essentially bribe the Spacing Guild to take unreliable satellite images of the planet, which they could then blame on desert storms or other meteorological phenomenon as a way of concealing the numbers and sophistication of Arrakis' natives. Kynes saw the Fremen industriously making garments from spice cloth, manufacturing still suits, processing and storing water in large quantities. And in return, he told anyone who would listen of his dream. A dream of a green Arrakis. An Arrakis where you no longer had to worry about wasting water, where it was literally as free as the air you breathe. At first, most of the sietch dismissed him as either crazy or an idiot. But Prelude-Kynes was neither. He was a scientist. He didn't just tell them that it could be done, he told them and explained to them, as best he could, how it could be done. And slowly but surely, more and more people began to take him seriously. Meanwhile, the leaders of the sietch were busy deciding whether or not he should live or die. The Fremen are not fond of outsiders, and though he had saved Stilgar and his friends, there was no getting around the fact that he still technically served the Imperium, which they suspected would not have the best interests of the Fremen at heart, if Kynes ever revealed what he'd seen. After days of deliberation, the Naib of the Redwall Sietch, Haynar, decided that Kynes had to die, and appointed a warrior named Liet to do the deed. Remember how I said earlier when Prelude-Kynes couldn't read a room to save his life? Well, ironically enough, it was his own obliviousness that ended up saving his life. When Liet came to kill Kynes, he was holding forth to a crowd of Fremen, lecturing them on ecology and planetology and the ways in which Arrakis could be terraformed into something wet and green, which to any desert dweller, Fremen or otherwise, must sound like the closest thing to paradise. As Liet approached, poisoned crysknife drawn and ready to kill the Outlander, everyone except Kynes saw him coming and froze, waiting to see what happened. Kynes, oblivious as ever, continued to speechify. Kynes didn't even notice his would-be killer until the man was standing right in front of him, knife held at his side and ready to stab. Confused and annoyed by this interruption of his lecture, Kynes surprised everyone by gently pushing Liet to one side and saying, "Remove yourself." For a long moment, Liet just stood there to the side, frozen and mind whirling. As he had approached the Outlander, he could not help but hear Kynes' words about the future of Arrakis, of a place of plenty and water. And despite himself, the planetologist's words had captured his imagination. And now, this man, who said that the Fremen could make their world into a paradise, had just told him to remove himself. Prelude-Kynes' words were either the words of a madman or a visionary, and Liet honestly could not tell which. But he knew that if he killed the man now, he might very well be remembered for all time as Liet, Destroyer of Dreams, for by killing Prelude-Kynes, he would also kill the dream of plentiful water, of peace and prosperity among the people of Arrakis, of lives no longer bound by the fear of wasting water. But ironclad Fremen tradition dictated that a crysknife cannot be returned to its sheath without drawing blood, and so Liet chose to remove himself by literally falling on his sword. Kynes, still holding forth about ecology, noticed none of this. He remained utterly oblivious to what had just happened until he finished speaking, noticed that everyone in the cavern was staring, then turned around and saw the corpse lying at his feet. Even then, he hadn't the foggiest idea of why the man was dead or of how close he himself had come to dying. To the Fremen, however, this could only be a sign from God. Prelude-Kynes was not a madman, he was a true prophet. An understandable mistake, the differences are subtle, and from that day forward, every member of the Redwall Siege threw themselves wholeheartedly into the effort of terraforming Arrakis and spreading the word to every Siege on the planet. Soon, the whole of the Fremen people was united in realizing Prelude-Kynes' dream. Kynes himself was confused by this sudden turn of events, but he was never a man to look a gift horse in the mouth. He sent one final ecological report to the Emperor and then essentially went native, throwing himself wholly into directing the Fremen in the methods of terraforming Arrakis. He showed them how to collect ecological data, new methods of trapping and storing water, and, after having them imported via smugglers, instructed the Fremen in the ways of using certain plants like poverty grass to anchor the ever-shifting dunes of Arrakis and making them stable. From there, Kynes began introducing further plant and animal species, from Scotch pines and incense bushes to kangaroo mice and dwarf owls, slowly but surely building a thriving desert ecosystem. Perhaps his greatest accomplishment was the creation of Plaster Basin, a cave that was swiftly transformed into a subterranean garden, with rivers and ponds and fruit trees, among other things. To all the Fremen who saw it, it looked like a foretaste of paradise, a glimpse of what their entire world might one day be. The Fremen who saw this knew that they themselves would not live to see a green Arrakis. Kynes' plan would take generations, if not centuries, but they believed that if they did this, one day their children, their grandchildren, or their great-grandchildren might one day behold the miracle. Prelude-Kynes went on to marry Freyth, the older sister of Stilgar, who became one of his most devoted disciples, and their union produced a son, Liet Kynes. As soon as the boy was old enough to understand, Kynes began instructing him in science, intending one day for the boy to inherit his post as imperial planetologist. Young Liet proved a quick study, inheriting his father's intellect, but thankfully not inheriting the man's lack of social awareness. Instead, he possessed the pragmatic wisdom of his mother's people. For all that he'd been accepted by them and become their spiritual leader, the prophet Kynes, Pardot had only been adopted by the Fremen. First and foremost, he would always be a planetologist. Liet Kynes was born a Fremen to the marrow of his bones. And so, the next decade or so passed quietly. Well, as quiet as life on Arrakis can be. The Fremen continued Kynes' terraforming work, while also occasionally launching raids on the Harkonnens, much to their frustration. One day, Liet Kynes, now in his teens, along with his best friend Warwick, were given the task of traveling to the southernmost pole of Arrakis to deliver the regular bribe of spice to the water smugglers, who in turn would transfer it to the Spacing Guild. After delivering the bribe to the water merchant Rondo Tuek, the two young men noticed what seemed to be a carefully concealed game trail heading up into the mountains. Bitten by the bug of curiosity, they followed the trail and ended up stumbling upon one of the hideouts of the renegade Earl Dominic Vernius. After being exiled from Ix and sending their children to Caladan, Earl Vernius and his wife had gone their separate ways, the better to hide from anyone looking to collect the imperial bounty on their heads. Unfortunately, word had recently reached Earl Dominic that his wife had been tracked down and executed by the Emperor Sardaukar, and he was still trying to get over that. In fact, one could argue he never got over it. And perhaps because of this, instead of killing the two boys for discovering his secret hideout, he instead granted them hospitality and even asked them for advice on how to better conceal his facility. The Earl's hospitality caused the two young Fremen to come away from the exchange with a favorable opinion of Earl Dominic, unusual for an outlander, and the two returned to the sietch. Life would have passed by peacefully, except that Liet and Warwick were young men, and, like most young men, were developing an interest in girls, specifically one girl, Fionnuala, the daughter of the sietch's leader, Haenar. Like many teenage girls, both real and fictional, Fionnuala was more than a little flattered that more than one guy was vying for her attention, one of them being the son of the great prophet Kynes. However, she ultimately was unwilling to choose between the two herself, and so decided to settle the matter with a challenge. She left each boy a message, telling them that she would be waiting for them at a cave some great distance away from the sietch. Each boy was to take a sandworm and ride to the cave. The first one to get there would become Fionnuala's husband. Unfortunately, Warwick won that race, and though Liet tried to be happy for his best friend, he just couldn't quite get over his first case of heartbreak. Young Liet had maintained his contact with Earl Dominic Vernius, and hearing that the man was going to Seleucia Secundus, the world that had inspired his father into planetology in the first place, the young Fremen decided to go with them, feeling that seeing the world that had inspired his father might help him find himself, if you will. Liet did indeed find something starkly beautiful and inspiring about Seleucia Secundus, a world that had once been ravaged by atomics and now boasting some of the most savage life forms in the galaxy. And that's not including the Sardaukar themselves, brutal men descended from former prisoners and trained to become the Emperor's elite guard, and of course, the last place in the galaxy where you would look for a fugitive nobleman, which is of course the very reason why Earl Dominic had a bolt hole there. However, while Seleucia Secundus was an eye-opening experience for Liet, this could only be a temporary sojourn, and eventually he began to feel the call of home. Having sent word ahead that he was coming back home, Liet found Warwick to be the one waiting for him at the South Pole when he finally got back to Arrakis, and the two old friends swapped stories as they rode a sandworm north towards home. Warwick spoke of his marriage to Fionnuala and of his newborn son, named Liet Kynes in honor of his best friend. In return, Liet regaled Warwick with tales of Seleucia Secundus, of Earl Dominic, and of the men who served under him in his exile. Neither Fremen knew, of course, that it was after this return to Arrakis that the Earl would plan his desperate attempt to blow up Khitan with atomics, only to be betrayed and then destroy himself and the Sardaukar sent to capture him. Even if the two friends had known, this would soon have become the least of their worries as they found themselves caught out in the middle of the desert during a Coriolis storm. A Coriolis storm is a massive sandstorm whose winds are made even faster due to the rotation of Arrakis itself. Abandoning the sandworm, the two friends soon found a place where they could hide from the winds. Unfortunately, it was a crevice that was only large enough for one of them. Liet insisted that Warwick should use the shelter, as he had a wife and son to care for. Warwick insisted that Liet should be saved, as he was the son of the prophet Kynes. In the end, and with the storm bearing down on them, the two men agreed to settle the matter by throwing notched tally sticks at a nearby dune. Whosever stick sunk deepest would get the shelter. Liet ultimately won, and as Warwick shoved his friend into the crevice, he made him promise to protect Fionnuala and their son should the worst happen to him. By some mad miracle, though, Warwick managed to actually survive the storm. However, given that the wind and sand had scoured much of the flesh from his body, including the skin of his face, it might have been better if he had simply died. Liet was able to bring Warwick back to the Red Wall sietch, but there was simply no healing his injuries. Warwick was living on borrowed time. But before the wind and sand had scoured his own eyes from their sockets, Warwick insisted that he had seen a glimpse of the future. He needed to see those visions and relate them to his friends and his people before he died. To do that, he insisted he needed to drink the deadly water of life, a poison that only a Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother can survive. And indeed, Warwick did die after consuming the poison, but before he did, he managed to relate to his people what he had seen with his mind's eye. The hawk and the mouse are the same. They do not know what they have created. Born of water, dies in sand. They think they can control him, but they are deluded. Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from beyond, he will be everything we dreamed, but nothing like we expected. To the other Fremen, this seemed little more than the ravings of a dying man. But of course, to anyone who has read Dune, these are clearly foreshadowings of the events of that first book. The hawk and mouse are the same obviously refers to Paul, whose Fremen name, Muad'Dib, is the name of a desert mouse, and the hawk is the symbol of House Atreides. Lines like, "They think they can control him, but they are deluded," obviously refers to the Bene Gesserit and their hubris that their breeding program will go exactly as planned. But of course, Paul would not be a compliant puppet of the Sisterhood. In fact, he would be very much their great enemy. The only line that I don't understand is "born of water, dies in sand." If anyone can understand what that might refer to, please mention it in the comments section, or maybe send this by Quinn's Ideas, as he is the foremost Dune expert on YouTube, and he might know it. Either way, Warwick ultimately succumbed to the poison, and Liet honored his friend's last wish to care for his wife and son. As if to further compound the tragedy, a few months later, Prelude-Kynes, the prophet of the Fremen, also died. He had been inspecting the plaster basin when part of the cave suddenly fell in, crushing him under tons of rock. And thus, Liet inherited his father's position as Imperial Planetologist of Arrakis. Shortly after his father's death, Kynes traveled to Khitan, both to have his position as Imperial Planetologist formally recognized, and to see if it might be possible to petition the Emperor to aid the Fremen people, who continued to suffer the depredations of the cruel and sadistic Harkonnens and their associates. The Imperial audience was brief and perfunctory, and it told the young Fremen everything he needed to know. Shaddam Corrino was an arrogant, pompous, self-absorbed ass. Even if the normally self-reliant Fremen had been willing to appeal to the Emperor for help, it was clear that he would give none, for no other reason than that he simply didn't care. Liet Kynes was far more militant than his father, and he knew that if the Fremen were to shake off the yoke of Harkonnen oppression, or the oppression of any other house that was given fiefdom of Arrakis, they would have to do it themselves. Egged on by the Prophet's son and by Stilgar, now one of the Redwall Sietch's greatest warriors, the Fremen stepped up their attacks on Harkonnen facilities, relying on their bribes to the Spacing Guild to ensure that the Harkonnens never had accurate knowledge of their whereabouts or their numbers. Kynes, now aware of the Emperor's crackdown on spice hoarding, directed the Fremen to focus their attacks on hidden spice storage facilities, knowing that the Baron Harkonnen would not be able to admit to the raids without also admitting to his crime. It was also at his insistence that the Fremen deal with the Spacing Guild directly, rather than through the middlemen of the water merchants of Arrakis. The young planetologist and his uncle Stilgar drove the point home by tracking down the water merchant that had sold out Earl Dominic Vernius to the Sardaukar and leaving him mutilated in his own house. Amidst all of this, Kynes made sure to continue the terraforming projects of his father, and he even ended up siring a daughter on his new wife Ferula, a little girl named Chani. The Fremen, of course, knew nothing of the Emperor's plan to destroy Arrakis and make the Imperium dependent on his artificial spice alternative, Amal, or of just how close their planet had come to annihilation when the Emperor showed up, having been tipped off by the Spacing Guild as to the Baron's hoarding, and in fact the Spacing Guild had been tipped off by the Fremen. It really isn't all that surprising that during the big climax of the Prelude to Dune trilogy, the Fremen fade into the background. But there is one last event worth mentioning. Some weeks after the failure of Project Amal and of the Emperor's attempt to grab power for himself, the very same day that Duke Leto Atreides returned to Caladan and presented his newborn son and heir, Paul, to the people of his world, the Fremen of the Redwall Sietch bore witness to what could only have been a great omen. A short distance away, within sight of the Sietch itself, over a dozen sandworms had congregated, This in itself was unheard of, as sandworms are immensely territorial, and never before had more than two been seen together. But the sandworms were not fighting. Instead, they simply circled about one that was older and larger than the rest. As the Fremen watched, the giant ancient sandworm died, its body disintegrating into the myriad of sand trout that burrowed into the sand, leaving behind almost no evidence that the great worm had ever been. Shai-Hulud, the old great king of the desert, had died, making way for something, someone new. And on that bit of obvious foreshadowing, we at last leave behind the universe of Dune. My next upload on Brainstorm lore will be the following Saturday rather than on Tuesday like usual, partly to celebrate Halloween, and partly to thank all the new subscribers that I've been getting lately, as I feel you guys deserve something a little special next time. Until then. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, and check out our website at studiobrainstorm.net. And if you have a story that you think is worth telling, we are more than happy to help you publish it. Thank you, and have a nice day.